Racist waitress insults black patron, then learns he's the restaurant owner's best friend. The restaurant sits nestled between an old bookstore and a vintage record shop, both of which add a unique charm to the area. Outside, the sounds of the city create a lively backdrop. Cars rumble by in a steady flow, a bus pulls up across the street, releasing a small crowd of commuters onto the sidewalk. People pass by, some chatting, some lost in thought, their voices blending into a low hum that fills the air. The parking lot adjacent to the restaurant bustles with activity as cars come and go, their engines revving and tires crunching on the gravel as they maneuver into narrow spaces. The weather is pleasantly warm for this time of day, with a soft breeze carrying the smell of food from the restaurant's kitchen. Inside, the restaurant holds a kind of timeless charm, almost as if it hasn't changed in decades. There's an old-school diner vibe, a combination of classic American and vintage decor. The red leather booths, slightly worn but comfortable, line the walls, each with its own small table topped with a vase holding a single, plastic daisy. Sunlight filters through the large, square windows, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. It's late afternoon, and the fading light gives the entire space a peaceful, almost nostalgic atmosphere. In one corner, an old jukebox stands, a relic from a different era. The songs it plays are faint but unmistakable, classic rock, soulful ballads, and even a few country hits from decades past. The low hum of the jukebox blends seamlessly with the quiet murmur of patrons' conversations and the clinking of cutlery on plates. Every now and then, the soft chime of a bell rings out from behind the counter as an order is ready, prompting the waitstaff to move with a practiced efficiency. The kitchen, partially visible from the dining area, is a hub of activity. A faint cloud of steam and the smell of frying food waft through the open window where the cooks work tirelessly, flipping burgers, plating fries, and pouring coffee. The air is thick with the scent of grilled meat, toasted bread, and the sharp tang of freshly brewed coffee. In the center of the dining area, a counter runs along the length of the room, lined with metal stools, their red vinyl cushions slightly worn and faded. Some patrons sit here alone, lost in thought as they sip their coffee or read the paper. The restaurant's lighting is warm and soft, creating a cozy, inviting glow that contrasts sharply with the harsh, fluorescent lights outside in the parking lot. The lights hang low, suspended from long cords, casting a golden hue over each booth. The entire space feels like a step back in time, a place that's remained untouched by the fast-paced changes of the world outside. There's a sense of familiarity, of comfort, that settles over everyone who walks in, a small refuge from the noise and chaos of the world beyond its doors. In one of the booths, an elderly couple sits side by side, their heads close together as they share a slice of pie. Across the room, a family with 2 young children is finishing their meal, the kids laughing as they play with the last of their fries. A few solo patrons sit scattered around, some with laptops open, others simply enjoying a quiet moment with their coffee. The waitstaff moves through the space with a practiced ease, their expressions friendly but reserved, their interactions with patrons smooth and efficient. At the counter, a waitress pauses to chat with a regular, her voice carrying a slight edge as she teases him about his usual order. She's a middle-aged woman with an air of authority, her movements quick and precise as she sets down a fresh pot of coffee and fills his mug without him even asking. She exudes a certain energy, one that suggests she's been doing this for years and knows every corner of this place like the back of her hand. This is her domain, and she treats it as such, moving with a confidence that borders on entitlement. Her gaze sweeps over the room, taking in every detail, every patron, every subtle shift in the atmosphere. She notices everything, from the slightest mess on a table to the way each person carries themselves. As she moves about, she seems to mark her territory with each step, reinforcing her presence in a way that is unmistakable. Today, however, there's a slight change in the usual flow. A new customer has just walked in, a tall, well-dressed black man. He steps inside, pausing for a moment to take in the surroundings, his expression calm and composed. He seems at ease, though there's a quiet strength about him, a presence that's hard to ignore. He scans the room briefly before choosing a booth near the window, his movements unhurried as he settles in. From behind the counter, the waitress notices him immediately. Her eyes narrow just slightly, a fleeting expression of irritation flashing across her face before she masks it with a practiced, polite smile. She watches him for a moment, sizing him up as he glances at the menu, seemingly oblivious to her scrutiny. The waitress moves toward his booth with a purposeful stride, her expression carefully neutral, though a hint of something colder lurks just beneath the surface. As she approaches, the noise around them seems to fade slightly, as if the room is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. There's a tension in the air now, subtle but palpable, a shift in the atmosphere that no one else seems to notice yet. The man looks up as she reaches his table, offering a polite smile, but the waitress's response is lukewarm at best, her voice carrying a tone that borders on dismissive. "What can I get you?" she asks, her words clipped, her gaze steady as she waits for his answer. The man remains polite, responding in a calm, measured tone as he places his order. There's nothing in his demeanor to suggest he's bothered by her attitude. He remains composed, meeting her gaze without hesitation. Yet, there's an underlying tension here, an unspoken challenge in the way they regard each other, a subtle but undeniable clash of perspectives. As she walks away to place his order, the waitress's expression hardens slightly. She mutters something under her breath, a comment too soft for anyone else to hear but filled with an unmistakable edge. She's annoyed, perhaps even a little threatened by his presence, though it's hard to pinpoint exactly why. There's something about him that unsettles her, something that disrupts the comfortable routine of her day. She can feel a shift in the air, a sense of unease that lingers even as she resumes her tasks. The story shifts to a closer look at the two main characters, highlighting the stark contrast in their personalities. The waitress, a middle-aged white woman with a slight, ever-present frown, moves about the restaurant with a brisk efficiency. She has a hardened look, one that speaks of years spent in the service industry but also of a certain closed-mindedness, an ingrained sense of superiority that she carries like an invisible shield. Her movements are sharp, purposeful, and there's an air of impatience in her every step, as though she's always on the brink of being irritated by something or someone. Her expression is cold, her lips a thin line as she goes about her tasks, her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings as if keeping score. She's known to her regulars for her no-nonsense attitude, and while she might come across as slightly abrasive, some patrons have learned to overlook it, chalking it up to her years on the job. But to others, especially those who don't fit her idea of regular patrons, she can be less than welcoming. Today, her demeanor shifts slightly as she glances over at the new customer sitting by the window. A black man, dressed in business casual attire, his posture relaxed yet self-assured. There's a calm confidence in the way he sits, his shoulders relaxed, hands resting casually on the table as he scans the menu. The man, the black patron, has an air of quiet dignity. He's the type of person who observes more than he speaks, his gaze steady and thoughtful as he takes in his surroundings. He doesn't miss the way the waitress looks at him, her gaze lingering a beat too long, her eyes narrowing just slightly before she masks it with a polite smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. But he doesn't react. Instead, he simply returns to the menu, unbothered, his expression serene. It's clear that he's dealt with similar situations before, his calmness suggesting a practiced resilience, a patience that comes from years of experience. When she finally approaches his table, the waitress's tone is polite, but there's an unmistakable chill beneath her words, a subtle dismissiveness that would be easy to miss for anyone who wasn't paying close attention. The man, however, is observant. He notices the way she barely looks at him as she takes his order, her gaze drifting around the room as if she's already moving on to the next task. He doesn't let it bother him. Instead, he speaks in a polite, even tone, his words calm and measured as he places his order. Their interaction is brief, but the tension is palpable. There's a clear imbalance in the way they perceive each other. She sees him as an inconvenience, an outsider disrupting her routine, while he remains unfazed, his demeanor steady and unyielding. He maintains a respectful tone, but there's a quiet strength in his words, a hint of defiance in the way he meets her gaze without flinching. It's a subtle challenge, one that she seems to recognize, her expression hardening ever so slightly as she walks away. As she moves back to the counter, the waitress mutters something under her breath, a faint, barely audible comment that's tinged with irritation. She busies herself with preparing his order, her movements brisk and slightly more forceful than necessary, as though she's expending some of her frustration on the task. She glances back at him occasionally, her expression a mix of annoyance and a touch of disdain, her mind racing with thoughts she wouldn't dare say out loud. Meanwhile, the man sits quietly, his attention shifting between the menu and the view outside the window. He doesn't seem perturbed by her attitude. Instead, he carries himself with a quiet dignity, an unspoken strength that radiates from his calm demeanor. There's a slight smile on his face, a look of peaceful contentment that seems to only add to her irritation. It's as though he's unfazed by her attitude, as though he's seen it all before and isn't willing to let it disrupt his peace. The other patrons seem oblivious to the subtle tension between them, but the waitress can feel it, her irritation growing with each passing moment. She finds herself glancing over at him more often than necessary, each look intensifying her frustration. There's something about his calmness, his self-assured demeanor, that seems to unsettle her, as if his mere presence is a challenge to her authority, her sense of control over her domain. The man, however, remains composed, his gaze unwavering as he waits patiently for his order. He's polite when she returns with his food, offering a quiet thank you as she sets the plate down in front of him. She responds with a curt nod, her voice tight as she mumbles a barely audible "you're welcomed" before walking away without another word. Throughout his meal, the waitress finds herself unable to ignore him, her gaze drawn to his table more often than she'd care to admit. There's something about him that bothers her, something she can't quite put into words. It's as though his presence alone disrupts the comfortable routine of her day, a silent reminder of something she doesn't want to confront. She catches herself scowling in his direction more than once, quickly masking her expression whenever he looks up, though he seems to take no notice of her subtle hostility. Despite her growing irritation, the man remains unfazed. He eats his meal in silence, occasionally glancing out the window or checking his watch, his demeanor calm and composed. There's a quiet resilience in him, a patience that seems to only heighten her frustration, as though he's challenging her without ever saying a word. She can feel the tension building, a silent clash of wills that hangs in the air between them, growing heavier with each passing moment. By the time he finishes his meal, the waitress is visibly tense, her expression barely concealing her irritation as she watches him prepare to leave. He stands up, taking his time as he gathers his belongings, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He glances in her direction one last time, offering a polite nod as he heads toward the door, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to her barely concealed frustration. As he exits, the waitress lets out a quiet sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing slightly as the tension dissipates. Yet, there's a lingering sense of unease, a feeling that she can't quite shake, as though his presence has left an imprint on her day, a subtle disruption that lingers even after he's gone. She shakes her head, dismissing the thought as she returns to her routine, but there's a faint scowl on her face, a hint of irritation that refuses to fade. The conflict intensifies gradually, with the waitress's frustration morphing into open hostility. At first, her actions are subtle, a sharp look here, a cold response there. However, as the black patron continues to remain calm and unreactive, her annoyance simmers and begins to surface more overtly. The waitress begins to adopt a mocking tone, a condescending smile forming as she speaks. Her words are laced with sarcasm as she asks if he needs extra help with the menu, implying he might not understand it. She speaks louder than necessary, drawing subtle attention from nearby tables, but the man remains unfazed, his calmness only further fueling her irritation. In her mind, his composed demeanor feels like an affront to her authority, a silent defiance that she can't tolerate. She mutters under her breath, throwing in vaguely racially charged comments as if testing his patience. A few patrons glance up at the exchanges, sensing the hostility, but they quickly look away, perhaps wary of getting involved. The uncomfortable silence from the other customers only adds to the heavy atmosphere, a sense of complicity lingering in the air. Throughout this, the black patron remains polite, responding in a calm and dignified manner, his voice steady as he answers her questions or responds to her remarks with quiet respect. He continues to place his orders without a hint of agitation, a stark contrast to her increasingly antagonistic behavior. There's a dignity in his composure, a resilience that seems to radiate from him as he refuses to let her attitude affect him. The waitress's hostility grows bolder, emboldened by his lack of reaction. She makes sarcastic remarks about his order, questioning his choice in a way that's both patronizing and dismissive. Her voice drips with condescension as she comments on his appearance, subtly implying that he doesn't belong in a place like this. She leans into the provocation, expecting him to lose his temper, but he doesn't, his calmness seemingly unwavering. Instead, he merely raises an eyebrow or offers a polite smile, refusing to give her the reaction she's looking for. As the exchanges continue, the waitress's irritation turns to outright hostility. She begins to throw in more overtly racially charged language, her tone laced with entitlement and disdain. She makes snide comments, implying that he's wasting her time or suggesting he should take his business elsewhere. The patron, however, continues to meet her remarks with composure, his responses calm yet pointed, subtly challenging her without ever raising his voice. At this point, the other staff members start to notice the tension. A few of them glance over, but no one steps in, either out of discomfort or indifference. Some of the other patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats, aware of the hostility but choosing to ignore it, their silence contributing to the oppressive atmosphere. The man, however, remains undeterred. His calm, steady presence is a stark contrast to the waitress's escalating hostility, his silence a form of quiet defiance that seems to frustrate her further. The waitress's tone becomes harsher, her words biting as she leans into the provocation, her voice loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. She sneers, making assumptions about him, her words dripping with judgment as she attempts to undermine his dignity. She seems determined to push him to his breaking point, to force a reaction that would justify her behavior. But the patron remains composed, his responses calm and measured, as though he's refusing to play into her expectations. Her frustration mounts as she realizes he won't respond in the way she wants. Her anger spills over, her tone shifting from sarcasm to outright hostility, and she mutters an insult under her breath, barely concealing her disdain. She sneers, making it clear that she doesn't believe he belongs there, her words laced with entitlement and prejudice. Yet, despite her provocations, he maintains his dignity, his calmness only seeming to unsettle her further. The tension in the restaurant becomes palpable, a heavy silence hanging over the tables as patrons and staff alike sense the escalating conflict. The black patron remains undeterred, his composure unbroken as he meets her hostility with quiet strength. He continues to respond politely, his words calm and respectful, a stark contrast to her increasingly aggressive tone. The silent complicity of the other patrons only serves to amplify the discomfort, a sense of unease settling over the room as the tension reaches a boiling point. This continued patience on his part frustrates the waitress, her hostility becoming more overt as she realizes she can't break his composure. She begins to make thinly veiled comments, using racially charged language in an attempt to provoke him. She leans in closer, her words sharper, louder, hoping to draw him into an argument, but he remains unperturbed. His calm demeanor is a silent defiance, a refusal to be drawn into her hostility, and this only seems to fuel her anger. As the conflict escalates, it becomes clear that the black patron's calmness is not out of weakness, but out of a sense of dignity and restraint. He refuses to give her the reaction she's looking for, his silence a powerful statement that seems to unsettle her more than any words could. The tension in the room thickens, an unspoken awareness settling over the patrons as they watch the scene unfold, their silence a silent acknowledgement of the hostility but a refusal to intervene. Finally, after a particularly biting remark from the waitress, the patron pauses, meeting her gaze with a calm, steady look. His eyes are unwavering, a silent challenge that she can't ignore. There's a subtle shift in his demeanor, a quiet strength that seems to speak volumes, and for a brief moment, she falters, her expression flickering with uncertainty. The patrons and staff, who have been watching the exchange from a distance, hold their breaths, sensing that the situation has reached a critical point. But the patron simply takes a deep breath, his calmness unshaken, his dignity intact. He refuses to be drawn into her anger, his silence a form of resilience that speaks louder than any words. It's a powerful moment, one that leaves her momentarily speechless, as though she realizes that her attempts to provoke him have only highlighted her own prejudice. The room is silent, a heavy tension lingering in the air, as the patron finally rises to leave, his calm, dignified presence a stark contrast to the waitress's hostility. This moment leaves a lasting impression on the patrons, a sense of unease settling over the room as they watch him walk away. His quiet strength a reminder of the dignity that he maintained despite her hostility. The waitress, left standing in silence, seems momentarily thrown off balance, her expression one of frustration mixed with a hint of regret, as though she realizes, too late, the impact of her actions. The air in the diner seemed to thicken as the waitress approached the man's booth, her steps louder, more forceful than before. She had a tray in one hand, carrying his chicken sandwich and fries, but her expression was anything but welcoming. Her eyes narrowed as she set the plate down in front of him, not bothering to hide her disdain. Your food, she said, her tone clipped, as though serving him was a chore rather than her job. The patron thanked her, his calm demeanor unbroken as he adjusted the napkin on his lap and took a sip of the water she'd brought earlier. He didn't look up, didn't react to the hostility in her voice, and his composed manner seemed to irritate her further. A few moments passed as he began his meal in silence, each bite taken with quiet appreciation. But his tranquility only seemed to fuel her annoyance. She loitered nearby, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that bordered on resentment. Finally, she walked back over, clearing her throat in a loud, exaggerated manner, forcing him to look up. Is everything okay here? I wouldn't want you to think we don't take care of our customers. He looked up, noting the sharp edge in her voice. Yes, everything's fine, thank you. But she didn't leave. Instead, she leaned over the table, her hand gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. You know, we don't get too many people like you around here. He raised an eyebrow, still maintaining his composure. People like me? Yeah. People who think they can come in here and just, well, take up space. Maybe expect special treatment. Her eyes were locked onto his, challenging him to react. The patron's face remained calm, though his eyes sharpened as he met her gaze. I'm here as a paying customer, just like anyone else, he replied, his voice steady but firm. She let out a short, dismissive laugh. Sure you are. He shook his head, choosing not to engage further, and returned to his meal. His lack of reaction seemed to throw her off balance for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure, scowling as she straightened up. She muttered something under her breath and turned away, walking back to the counter, where she stood with her arms crossed, casting him occasional glances as if daring him to make a wrong move. When he finished his meal, he gathered his things, preparing to leave. But as he stood up and started toward the exit, the waitress intercepted him, stepping directly in his path with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. You think you can just come in here, do whatever you want, and leave? She asked, her voice low and menacing, though a few nearby patrons turned their heads in curiosity. He took a deep breath, his calm exterior unwavering. I paid for my meal, I enjoyed it, and now I'm leaving. Isn't that what most people do? Her eyes narrowed. She took a step closer, invading his personal space in a way that felt deliberate, almost as if she were daring him to react. Most people? Maybe. But I have a feeling you're not most people. He looked down at the distance between them, his eyes catching the intensity of her stare. Despite the situation, he didn't back away. Instead, he held his ground, his expression calm yet assertive. Please step aside, he said quietly, his voice unwavering, but she didn't budge. Instead, she lifted her arms slightly, as if considering placing a hand on his shoulder to push him back. The moment stretched, the tension palpable as patrons nearby watched with bated breath, some clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. He met her gaze without flinching, his tone steady as he repeated, I'm asking you to let me pass. The firmness in his voice seemed to startle her. She hesitated, her hand hovering midair, her expression shifting ever so slightly as she registered the strength in his words. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. After a tense pause, she finally dropped her arm, stepping back just enough to let him through. But she wasn't ready to let go entirely. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she muttered under her breath as he passed. He stopped, glancing back at her, and there was something in his eyes, an unwavering resilience, a quiet strength that seemed to catch her off guard. "I don't need to think I'm anything," he replied, his voice calm yet resolute. "But I do know one thing. No one deserves to be treated this way." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving her standing there, watching him with a mixture of frustration and confusion. The tension lingered in the air, a heavy silence falling over the diner as the other patrons, who had been observing the confrontation from a distance, exchanged uneasy glances. The waitress looked around, suddenly aware of the eyes on her. For a fleeting moment, there was a hint of self-consciousness in her expression, a realization that perhaps she had gone too far. But she quickly dismissed it, her face hardening as she turned away, pretending as though nothing had happened. The patron, now outside, paused just beyond the restaurant's entrance, taking a deep breath as he looked out at the city streets. There was a sense of dignity in his posture, a resilience that seemed unbreakable despite the hostility he had just endured. In that moment, he reflected on what had happened, the unfairness of it all. But he also felt a sense of pride in how he had handled the situation, without anger, without stooping to her level. It was a small victory, a reminder of his own strength and integrity. As the black patron, Michael, stepped out of the restaurant, a wave of relief washed over him. The bustling sounds of the diner faded into the background, and the evening air felt fresh against his skin. He had come for a meal, seeking a moment of peace and comfort, yet the altercation with the waitress lingered in his mind like an unwelcome shadow. Just as he reached the parking lot, the restaurant door swung open again, and in walked Robert, the owner. Michael's expression brightened immediately. He had known Robert for years. Their friendship was built on mutual respect, camaraderie, and shared experiences. Robert, a middle-aged man with a warm smile and a jovial demeanor, caught sight of Michael and quickly crossed the distance between them. "Michael, there you are," Robert exclaimed, his voice booming with genuine delight. He rushed forward, arms outstretched, and enveloped Michael in a hearty embrace. "It's been too long. I was just thinking about you." "Hey, Robert. Good to see you, man," Michael replied, returning the embrace with equal enthusiasm. In that moment, the tensions of the evening melted away, replaced by the warmth of friendship. They stepped back, holding each other at arm's length, exchanging smiles filled with understanding and history. "How's everything going? You've been busy with that new project, right?" Robert asked, genuinely interested in Michael's life. Their conversations always flowed easily, filled with laughter and the kind of banter only longtime friends could share. "Yeah, it's been a lot of work, but I'm getting there. Just needed a break tonight. Thought I'd treat myself to some good food," Michael replied, a hint of weariness creeping into his voice as he glanced back at the diner. "Didn't expect to deal with, well, you know." Robert's brow furrowed slightly, sensing the weight behind Michael's words. "What happened? You look a bit tense," he asked, concern replacing the joviality in his tone. Michael hesitated for a moment, contemplating whether to share the details of the confrontation with the waitress. But the truth spilled out. Just some unpleasantness with one of the staff. "You know how it is sometimes. People think they can say whatever they want." Robert's expression shifted to one of outrage and disbelief. "What? I can't believe that. You should have said something to me. I don't tolerate that kind of behavior in my restaurant." His protective nature as a friend and a business owner surged to the forefront. "I know, but I didn't want to make a scene," Michael replied, shrugging it off. "It's not worth it." While they conversed, the waitress, Karen, stood at the counter, her hands tense against the polished wood. She watched the interaction unfold with growing unease. Her smug demeanor from earlier had evaporated, replaced by a discomfort that seemed to seep into her very bones. The laughter and warmth shared between Michael and Robert felt like a stark contrast to the hostility she had displayed moments ago. As Michael and Robert continued their conversation, Robert turned to the restaurant. "Let me get you a drink. You know, I'm so glad you came by tonight. You've always been a good friend, and it means a lot to me to see you. Thanks, Robert. I appreciate that, Michael replied, his smile returning, the weight of the earlier encounter slowly lifting. Just then, Robert's eyes fell on Karen, who was standing near the cash register, fidgeting uncomfortably as she realized the dynamics had shifted. Hey, Karen, Robert called out, beckoning her over with a friendly wave. Come here for a second. Karen approached hesitantly, her heart racing. She felt the air thick with tension, acutely aware of how her earlier actions had set this moment into motion. As she neared, she could see the camaraderie between Michael and Robert, something she had unintentionally tried to disrupt. Michael, I want you to meet Karen. She's one of my best waitstaff, Robert said, his tone light, unaware of the heaviness that had preceded this moment. Nice to meet you, Michael said, extending his hand with a polite smile, though there was a subtle edge to his demeanor that Karen could not ignore. Yeah, nice to meet you, Karen replied, her voice wavering as she shook Michael's hand. A flash of recognition flickered in her eyes as she processed who he was, Robert's best friend, a man she had insulted moments ago. Her heart sank, realizing the magnitude of her actions. The color drained from her face, and for a brief moment, she stood there, frozen, grappling with a storm of shame and regret. She had not only disrespected a customer but had belittled someone who was an important part of Robert's life. As the realization hit her, her mind raced through the implications of her behavior, and she felt utterly exposed. Robert, sensing the tension, turned to Karen with a frown. What's the matter? Everything okay? Yeah, it's been a long day, she stammered, avoiding Michael's gaze. The weight of her earlier arrogance pressed down on her shoulders like an anchor. Michael watched her, his expression steady but firm. He saw the flicker of remorse in her eyes, and though part of him wanted to confront her directly, he chose restraint, embodying the dignity he had fought to maintain throughout the encounter. Robert, still oblivious to the deeper undercurrents, chuckled and clapped Michael on the shoulder. Well, we're lucky to have him around. Michael here is one of my closest friends. He's got a big heart and a lot of talent. You should take notes, Karen. The mention of talent only deepened Karen's sense of shame. She felt small and exposed, her earlier bravado now a distant memory. The confidence that had driven her remarks seemed foolish in the light of Michael's quiet strength. As Robert continued to chat, praising Michael, Karen's thoughts spiraled. She had let her biases cloud her judgment, and in doing so, had not only insulted a patron but had also jeopardized her standing with Robert, someone she respected. The realization of what she had lost weighed heavily on her, and she wished for the ground to swallow her whole. Anyway, Robert continued, let me get you that drink, Michael. Anything special you want? Just some water is fine, Robert, Michael replied, his tone calm, still maintaining an air of respect even amidst the discomfort. As Robert moved to the bar area, Karen stood rooted to the spot, wrestling with her emotions. She could see the kindness in Michael's demeanor, the way he carried himself with grace, and it made her feel even more inadequate. The room felt suffocating, and she knew she needed to change, but the path to that change seemed daunting. In that moment, Michael caught her eye, and for the first time, their gazes locked in an unspoken exchange. He wasn't seeking revenge. Instead, he was offering her a chance to acknowledge her wrongs. It was a moment of clarity for both of them. She realized that her actions had consequences, and he recognized the importance of holding space for others to learn and grow. Listen, Karen, Michael said, breaking the silence, his voice steady. I understand that sometimes people act out of ignorance or fear. I just hope you take this as a moment to reflect. Karen's heart raced. I'm really sorry, Michael. I didn't mean any of it. I let my biases get the best of me, and I should have treated you with respect. Michael nodded, appreciating her honesty, even if it was tinged with discomfort. Thank you for saying that. We all have our moments. It's how we choose to move forward that matters. Just then, Robert returned with a glass of water, placing it in front of Michael. Here you go. Now, let's celebrate this friendship, shall we? He said with a smile, oblivious to the deeper exchange that had just transpired. As the evening continued, Michael found himself reflecting on the encounter. while it had begun with conflict, it was transforming into something more. A lesson in humility and understanding for both Karen and himself. The restaurant atmosphere, once filled with tension, began to shift toward a sense of camaraderie and growth, hinting at the possibility of change. Karen stood by, feeling lighter as she absorbed the lessons from the encounter. She recognized that biases could be dismantled, that growth was possible, and that in their shared humanity, there lay a chance for redemption. And while the evening had begun with a bitter taste, it was now ending on a note of hope, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, understanding could still find its way through. As Robert returned to the counter, glass in hand, he immediately sensed something was off with Karen. She stood there, her hands fidgeting at her sides, her eyes darting between Michael and the table, her earlier smugness replaced by a palpable tension. "Karen, are you okay?" Robert asked, concern knitting his brow as he leaned against the counter. "You look a bit pale." She hesitated, her heart racing as guilt flooded her veins. Yeah, I'm fine," she stammered, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. But deep down, she knew it was a lie, and the panic was bubbling just beneath the surface. "Really? Because you seemed different just now. Is there something you want to talk about?" His tone was gentle but probing, the concern in his voice amplifying her anxiety. Karen swallowed hard, glancing over at Michael, who was engaged in a light-hearted conversation with Robert. They laughed together, their camaraderie evident, while she felt like an outsider, encased in a shell of her own making. She could see Michael's ease, his confidence contrasting sharply with her growing turmoil. "Robert, she started, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? That she had let her prejudices dictate her behavior? That she had insulted a man who was not only a patron but also a friend of the owner? She felt her cheeks flush with shame, the realization of her actions hitting her with full force. "Karen," Robert urged softly, "if something's bothering you, you can talk to me. I'm here to help." "I know," she replied, her voice shaky. I messed up. I really messed up." She could feel the tears threatening to spill over, and she blinked rapidly, willing herself to maintain composure. "What do you mean?" Robert asked, tilting his head slightly, encouraging her to continue. Taking a deep breath, Karen attempted to gather her thoughts. "When he came in, I treated him poorly. I didn't give him the respect he deserves. I was dismissive, and I said things I shouldn't have." The admission felt like a weight lifting off her chest, but the fear of what it meant lingered. Robert's expression shifted to one of disappointment, and for a moment, the room felt heavy with unspoken truths. "What do you mean by poorly? What exactly happened? I didn't see him for who he is. I let my biases cloud my judgment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could get away with it because I thought I was better." Robert's disappointment deepened, and Karen could see the hurt in his eyes. "That's not the kind of attitude we foster here. We treat everyone with respect, regardless of their background." "I know that now," she replied, the panic rising in her chest. "I was wrong and I can't take it back." The realization of her mistake crashed over her like a tidal wave, washing away her previous bravado. "What if he tells you? What if he never comes back? I could lose my job." "Karen," Robert said firmly, "you need to understand that your actions have consequences. You have to own up to them." His tone was steady, but it lacked the warmth she had expected. Instead, it felt more like a reprimand, a mirror reflecting her shortcomings. Watching Michael, who was laughing with Robert, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. He deserved better than the treatment she had given him. "I can't believe I let this happen," she whispered, more to herself than to Robert. "I let my own insecurities and prejudices dictate how I treated him. It's not who I want to be." Robert remained silent, his gaze unwavering as he studied her. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, and Karen could feel her heartbeat quickening as she grappled with the depth of her shame. She had crossed a line, and the consequences loomed over her like a dark cloud. As she continued to watch Michael and Robert converse, she felt the walls of her own making closing in. Their discussion about respect, dignity, and friendship echoed in her ears, and she felt small and insignificant, her actions a stark contrast to the warmth they shared. Why didn't I see it before? She thought, her mind racing with regret. Why didn't I recognize that everyone deserves respect? Each word exchanged between the two men felt like a reminder of her failure, a poignant contrast to the hatred she had displayed moments ago. "I'm sorry, Robert," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to let you down. I don't want to be this person anymore." He softened a bit, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We all have moments of weakness, Karen. What matters is how we choose to grow from them. It's not too late to change, but you have to be willing to put in the work." Tears brimmed in her eyes as the gravity of his words sank in. "I will," she promised, her heart racing with determination. "I'll make it right whatever it takes." "Good," he replied, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "That's the first step. Just remember, actions speak louder than words. Show him the respect he deserves." As Karen nodded, she felt a flicker of hope igniting within her. She would confront her biases, not only for Michael but for herself. She would strive to become a better person, one who could stand up against prejudice and discrimination rather than contribute to it. With that resolve, she took a deep breath, wiping her tears away and steeling herself for what lay ahead. She knew she would have to face Michael again, to apologize and seek forgiveness. It wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to confront the consequences of her actions and begin the path toward redemption. As Michael stepped out of the restaurant, the cool evening air hit his face, a welcome relief from the tense atmosphere inside. He took a moment to breathe deeply, allowing the crispness of the autumn breeze to clear his mind. Turning back, he glanced through the large glass windows, catching sight of Karen's uncomfortable expression as she spoke to Robert, the owner. The contrast between their casual conversation and the discomfort etched on her face painted a vivid picture that lingered in his thoughts. Michael leaned against his car, reflecting on the encounter. Initially, he had walked in with the hope of enjoying a simple meal, but the evening had unraveled into something far more complicated. He realized that in those moments of tension, he hadn't needed to prove his worth to anyone, especially not to someone like Karen, whose judgment had been clouded by prejudice. He had walked into that diner with an open heart, expecting to be treated like any other customer. Instead, he was met with disdain wrapped in a thin veneer of service. A wave of frustration washed over him as he thought back to her dismissive remarks, each one cutting deeper than the last. The audacity of her assumptions was almost laughable in its ignorance, yet it stung nonetheless. He could have easily let anger bubble over, letting her words get under his skin, but he hadn't. Instead, he had chosen to remain calm, to hold on to his dignity in the face of her hostility. The strength it took to control his emotions, to not let the hatred seep into his responses, filled him with a strange sense of pride. He had been raised to understand that resilience in the face of adversity is a hallmark of character, and tonight had tested that principle. He had fought against the urge to retaliate, to let loose a torrent of anger that would have satisfied his immediate desire for retribution. But instead, he chose to be the bigger person, reminding himself that his value was not defined by the opinions of others. As he leaned against the car, Michael felt the weight of sadness settle in his chest. It wasn't just about what had happened tonight, it was a stark reminder of a reality he faced daily. Each derogatory comment, every dismissive gesture, served as a reminder of the systemic biases that permeated society. He had grown accustomed to navigating a world that often saw him through a lens of prejudice, where his worth was questioned at every turn. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the emotions to wash over him. He felt an ache in his heart for those who lacked the strength or resources to stand up against such treatment. The thought of others, less resilient than he, facing similar encounters was a heavy burden to carry. Each day, countless individuals walked through life battling the same invisible enemies, their struggles often unseen and unacknowledged. Yet amid the sadness, there was a flicker of hope. He remembered the words of his mother, who had always told him, "Your dignity is yours alone. No one can take that from you." Her voice echoed in his mind as he realized that while the world could be cruel, he could choose how to respond. He could either let it consume him or use it as fuel for growth. Tonight's incident was just one of many he had faced throughout his life, a reminder of the daily struggle for respect and equality. He thought about the countless times he had walked into spaces where he felt the weight of judgment pressing down on him. But each experience had shaped him, forged his identity in the fires of adversity. He had learned to navigate through hostility with grace, using every slight as a stepping stone toward greater understanding and resilience. As Michael opened his eyes, he gazed back at the restaurant, watching Karen and Robert. The scene inside revealed a mixture of conversations, laughter, and camaraderie, yet he felt detached from it all. He wasn't seeking revenge, rather, he sought acknowledgement of the humanity behind the facade. He wished for understanding, for people to see beyond their biases and prejudices, to recognize the shared experience of being human. In that moment of reflection, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't enough to merely endure, he wanted to change the narrative, to be a voice for those who felt voiceless. He could use his experiences to educate, to bridge gaps, and to challenge ignorance wherever he found it. Michael straightened up, the weight of the encounter settling into a new resolve. He would carry this experience with him, not as a burden, but as a reminder of his strength and the importance of standing firm in his truth. The world might be filled with Karens, people who judged without understanding, but he refused to let their ignorance define him. With one last look at the restaurant, he turned and walked toward his car, feeling lighter. He would not let the experience mar his evening or his spirit. Instead, he would continue to shine his light, sharing stories of resilience and hope, fostering understanding in a world that desperately needed it. As he drove away, Michael felt a sense of liberation. He had confronted not just the waitress but also the internal battles that had haunted him for years. In choosing dignity over anger, he had reclaimed a part of himself that he would never allow to be diminished again. As Michael stood by his car, the fading light of day wrapped around him, he felt a deep sense of reflection settle in. The earlier encounter had stirred something within him, a recognition of the powerful role that allyship plays in the fight against discrimination. He turned to Robert, who was still processing their conversation, and felt compelled to share one last thought. "Robert, I believe that allyship is vital in these moments. It's not just about standing beside someone when things get tough. It's about actively working to dismantle the systems of discrimination that persist in our society. When individuals choose to confront prejudice head-on, they create a ripple effect that fosters respect and understanding. It's about listening, learning, and lending our voices to those who are often unheard." He paused, looking back toward the restaurant, where Karen now stood a few steps away, her expression a mixture of contemplation and humility. Every time we witness injustice and remain silent, we contribute to the problem. But when we stand together, we can challenge the narratives that divide us. This isn't just my fight, it's a collective struggle for dignity and respect. The weight of his words felt profound, resonating with the urgency of the moment. In situations like these, it's crucial for allies to recognize their power. Speaking up can be uncomfortable, but it's a necessary discomfort. Allies can amplify the voices of marginalized communities, showing solidarity not just through words but through action. As he continued, Michael felt a sense of pride rising within him. Resilience is woven into the fabric of our community. We face challenges every day, but each triumph, no matter how small, is a step toward a more equitable world. Moments like these serve as reminders that while the journey may be long, change is possible. It requires effort, understanding, and a commitment to standing together. The emotional tone of his reflections was strong, echoing the resolve that had shaped his own journey. We cannot afford to underestimate the power of connection and compassion. In a world that often judges by appearances, our unity can spark change. Each act of kindness, each confrontation of prejudice, builds a path toward a brighter future. As Michael prepared to drive away, he felt a renewed sense of hope. He realized that every interaction could be an opportunity to educate and inspire, to bridge gaps and cultivate empathy. "Let us be the change we wish to see," he concluded, his heart full. For in these moments of confrontation and reflection, we not only honor our own dignity but uplift one another, paving the way for a world that embraces respect and understanding. With that final thought, He drove off, leaving behind not just a restaurant but a moment that had the potential to ripple outward, igniting conversations about allyship, respect, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. If you found this story impactful, we encourage you to share it with your friends and family. Let's spread awareness about the importance of dignity, respect, and allyship in our communities. Your voice matters. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire change. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think we can collectively combat discrimination and foster understanding? Share your experiences and insights with us. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and remember, together we can create a world where everyone is treated with respect and equality.